Pulsar X2 is probably the most hyped mouse of the year so far, and for good reason. It's solid shell, wireless, sub 60 grams, and not terribly expensive, unlike some other mice, and can get very high CPS, making it one of the best mice for Minecraft as well as gaming as a whole.
He's Eric and I'm Devin, and before we talk about the performance in Minecraft, we're going to go over the shapes, spec, and other features of this mouse that will ultimately decide if this mouse is for you. And stick around till the end of the video to see where this mouse ends up in our tier list.
The X2 Medium is an ultra-lightweight medium-sized symmetrical mouse with side buttons on the left only. It has a solid shell with cutouts on the bottom to save weight. It's 120mm in length, 38mm tall, 63mm wide at the back flare, and around 60mm wide at the grip. To get value out of the way, the X2 is $95, which is a pretty good price for the mouse you're getting, especially compared to its competition. I consider the shape of the X2 to be a perfect marriage of the endgame gear XM1 and Logitech G4 X Superlight, with the addition of deep comfort grooves on the buttons. The profile of the X2 is similar to the XM1, the only notable differences being that the tip of the hump on the XM1 hits the base of the palm a bit more than the X2. The sides of the X2 are very flat and feel almost identical to those of the Superlight in shape and width. This makes the X2 far safer than the XM1, as the smaller flares don't feel the size of your palm or restrict finger placement as much. However, you do lose the ability to pull the mouse into your palm using the flares, which does lead to less stable overall grip. Personally, I would prefer slightly more flaring on the sides, but that's just my preference. The comfort grooves are my favorite part of the X2 as they let me feel very locked in and consistent. The comfort grooves are what allow me to deal with the overly flat sides, and I think the shape would be nigh unusable without them. Overall, the X2 has a very good and very safe shape, though perhaps not my favorite. I recommend it most for any kind of claw grip for medium to large hands, relaxed fingertip for medium-sized hands, and any kind of fingertip for large hands. Those with smaller hands should certainly go for the X2 Mini in my opinion. The X2 comes in just 57 grams, which is even lighter than the Superlight. It's very well balanced and movement feels effortless. The weight combined with the shape does make this one of my top 3 mice in aim trainers. Despite the low weight, the build quality on my X2 is nearly flawless. There is zero side flexing or creaking, very little button wobble, and only the tiniest bit of bottom flex even with the cutouts. There have been some reports of QC issues on the main buttons, but I have not experienced them personally. If you are concerned, I would recommend waiting for 1 or 2 new batches before buying. The next batch should be up for purchase on September 9th, 2022. Pulsar customer service is notoriously terrible, so I'd buy from a third-party retailer like Amazon or Max Gaming. Speaking of the main buttons, the X2 uses Kailh 8.0 switches, which are pretty well implemented. The flick weight's on the light to medium side, the tensioning is nice and bouncy, and there's a nice tactile response. There's also some post-travel, which makes the clicks feel a bit softer and more spammable. My one complaint with the buttons is that there's just a bit too much pre-travel at the tip of the button, which makes the clicks feel just a bit slower. The side buttons on the X2 are very good. They use quantum white dot switches, which feel very crisp and tactile. The buttons themselves are easy to hit and have a good amount of pre-travel and post-travel. The slight post-travel makes the buttons feel less harsh and more spammable than those on the Cone Pro, which was our previous gold standard. The scroll wheel uses a TTC gold encoder, which has very well defined steps while being pretty quiet. The scroll has a pretty tight tensioning, which makes it easy to control. The scroll click is also pretty good with light actuation and reasonable travel. Overall, this is probably my favorite scroll wheel. Here's a sound test of all the buttons. The stock feet in the X2 are large and have rounded edges, giving a very smooth glide. You definitely don't need to replace these with aftermarket skates, although they will be a slight improvement.
In terms of wireless performance, the X2 is comparable to other similarly priced wireless mice on the market. The X2 uses the same firmware base as Glorious wireless mice, and has similar click latency in our testing. The sensor on the X2 is the new Pixart 3395, which is the current top optical sensor other than Razer's Blackmagic collaborations with Pixar. The 3395 has performed extremely well ever since a firmware update that has patched some bugs. There is no noticeable motion latency and the tracking is flawless. The mouse also has adjustable demount down to 0 milliseconds, which will allow every single click to be registered. The battery life is pretty good, living up to its claim of roughly 70 hours use time per charge. However, the same cannot be said about the battery indicator. It is currently broken due to a software bug, and it will show 95% charge when the mouse is actually about to die, and it is just all over the place. However, it does reliably tell you when the mouse has reached 100% charge, so if your unit is the same as ours, I'd recommend just charging the mouse until it reads a full charge. Luckily, if you do get fucked over by the terrible battery indicator and the mouse dies on you, the X2 comes with an unreasonably good cable. The stock USB-C charging cable is extremely light and flexible, on par with some of the best stock cables on wired mice. However, there is little to no angle stress relief, so that could lead to the cable getting in the way while using it, depending on your setup. Before we get into the performance in Minecraft, it would mean a lot to us if you give us a like and subscribe. as we're trying to hit 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year. Now back to the review.
The X2 performs very well in all three major clicking methods in Minecraft. For jitter clicking, the relatively light buttons, good travel, and great tensioning make this mouse feel fantastic. I can jitter a consistent 14 to 15 CPS on this mouse, which is better than others. The X2 is also very good for butterfly clicking due to its wide buttons. On the left click, I can hit 26 to 28 CPS. However, the shape of the buttons makes butterflying the right mouse button a bit difficult. I can still hit 18 to 20 CPS on the right click, although I find myself hitting the scroll wheel. Luckily, the scroll tensioning keeps me from accidentally scrolling in-game. Although the coding isn't very grippy, I found that the buttons on the X2 can drag click surprisingly well. I can hit upwards of 40 CPS on both buttons, which is more than enough to god bridge, extend, and reduce. I've been trying to learn telebridging, and the X2 has been one of the best mice for extending thus far. The coding can get somewhat slippery with sweat, however, so keep that in mind if you drag click. Overall, the X2 is a fantastic mouse. Because of the great build, shape, weight, and features, it places at the top of S tier on our tier list.